The airplane wheels touched down on the runway with a gentle thud that sent relief washing through Staff Sergeant David Thompson's tired body. After 18 grueling hours of travel across multiple time zones, he was finally home. The familiar sight of Denver International Airport through the small airplane window made his heart race with excitement. It had been exactly 13 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days since he last saw American soil. David stretched his aching legs as the plane slowly taxied toward the gate. Around him, other passengers were already reaching for their bags and checking their phones, eager to reconnect with the world they had left behind. But David's mind was somewhere else entirely. He was thinking about his wife Kelly, probably at home right now making dinner, completely unaware that her husband was about to walk through their front door tonight instead of next month as originally planned. The surprise had taken months to coordinate. David's commanding officer had pulled some serious strings to get him an early leave, and David had sworn his army buddies to secrecy. Even his own parents didn't know he was coming home early. The plan was simple: catch a taxi straight home, ring the doorbell, and watch Kelly's face light up when she realized her prayers had been answered. As passengers began filing off the plane, David stood up slowly, his desert camouflage uniform wrinkled from the long journey. The uniform still smelled faintly of the Middle Eastern dust that seemed to get into everything over there. He grabbed his worn military duffel bag from the overhead compartment, the same bag that had been his constant companion through 3 different deployments. Walking through the jet bridge felt surreal. The carpet under his boots was clean and soft, so different from the rocky terrain he had been navigating for over a year. The air conditioning hit his face with a cool breeze that reminded him he was no longer in the scorching desert heat where temperatures regularly soared above 110 degrees. David entered the main terminal and was immediately struck by how normal everything looked. Families hugging each other, business travelers rushing to catch connecting flights, children laughing as they pressed their faces against the large windows watching planes take off and land. It was the America he had been fighting to protect, the peaceful everyday life that soldiers like him made possible. He paused for a moment, taking it all in. The sounds were different here too. Instead of helicopters overhead and distant explosions, he heard the gentle hum of conversation, announcements over the intercom, and the rolling wheels of suitcases on the polished floor. A small smile crossed his face as he realized he was really truly home. The Bronze Star medal in his chest pocket seemed to weigh a little heavier as he walked. That piece of metal represented 6 months of intense combat operations, where his unit had successfully rescued dozens of civilians trapped in hostile territory. The mission had been classified, which meant David couldn't even tell Kelly the full details of what he had been doing all this time. She only knew he was somewhere dangerous, doing something important for his country. As David made his way toward the baggage claim area, he noticed a few people glancing his way. Some smiled and nodded respectfully when they saw his uniform. An elderly man in a veteran's cap caught his eye and gave him a subtle salute, which David returned with a grateful nod. These small gestures of appreciation always meant more to him than people realized, but not everyone's looks were friendly. David had grown used to the suspicious stares over the years, the way some people seemed to see his skin color before they noticed his uniform. He had learned to keep his head high and focus on the positive interactions rather than let the negative ones bring him down. The baggage claim area was bustling with activity. David found the correct carousel and waited patiently as suitcases and bags began appearing on the conveyor belt. He checked his phone and saw several missed calls from his army buddy Jake, probably wondering if his flight had landed safely. David decided to call him back once he got to the taxi. While waiting for his additional gear bag to appear, David thought about the conversation he had with his 8-year-old daughter Mia just 2 days ago over a scratchy video call. She had been asking when Daddy was coming home, and he had to lie and say it would be a few more weeks. The look of disappointment on her little face through the computer screen had broken his heart, but he knew the surprise would be worth it. His gear bag finally appeared, a large military-issued bag containing his extra uniforms and equipment. David hefted both bags and began walking toward the exit, already imagining Kelly's shocked expression when she opened the front door. He had been practicing what he would say, but knew that when the moment came he would probably just grab her and hold her tight, without saying anything at all. The terminal was busy for a Tuesday evening, with travelers from all walks of life, moving in different directions. David felt a sense of pride knowing that all these people could go about their daily lives safely because of the sacrifices made by service members like himself and his fellow soldiers still deployed overseas. He walked past a coffee shop. The smell of fresh coffee made his mouth water. The coffee they served at the base was terrible, and David had been dreaming about a proper American cup of coffee for months. But right now, nothing could distract him from his mission to get home to his family. 2 airport security officers were standing near the information desk, and David noticed one of them watching him closely. The officer said something to his partner, who then also turned to look in David's direction. David didn't think much of it initially. Security personnel were trained to observe everything, and a man in military uniform carrying large bags would naturally draw their attention. But as David continued walking, he realized the officers had started following him. They stayed about 20 feet behind, speaking quietly into their radios while keeping their eyes locked on him. An uncomfortable feeling began growing in David's stomach. He had done nothing wrong, had all his proper identification, and was clearly a returning service member. Yet something about their behavior suggested they saw him as more than just another traveler. David tried to shake off the feeling and focus on getting home. In less than an hour, he would be holding his wife and daughter, and this whole journey would just be a memory. The officers were probably just doing their jobs, making sure everything was secure. There was no reason to worry about 2 security guards simply doing their duty to keep the airport safe. But deep down, David couldn't shake the feeling that this homecoming might not go as smoothly as he had planned. David could feel the eyes on his back as he approached the baggage carousel area. The 2 security officers who had been following him were now walking faster, closing the distance between them. He tried to convince himself it was just a coincidence. Maybe they were heading to the same area for completely unrelated reasons. But when he slowed down to check the flight information display, they slowed down too. When he picked up his pace, so did they. The uncomfortable knot in his stomach grew tighter. David had faced enemy fire in combat zones, had navigated through hostile territories where one wrong step could mean death, but somehow this situation in his own country's airport was making him more nervous than he cared to admit. He adjusted the strap of his duffel bag and kept walking, hoping they would lose interest and move on to whatever security matter actually required their attention. But his hopes were quickly dashed when he heard heavy footsteps approaching from behind, followed by a stern voice calling out, "Excuse me, sir, we need to speak with you." David turned around to see the 2 officers standing about 6 feet away from him. The first officer was a middle-aged white man with graying hair and a serious expression that suggested he took his job very seriously. His name tag read Officer Mitchell. The second officer was younger, maybe in his early 30s, with short brown hair and the kind of posture that screamed former military. His badge identified him as Officer Carson. "Good evening, officers," David replied politely, setting down his bags. "Is there something I can help you with?" Officer Mitchell stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. "We're going to need to see some identification. We've received reports of suspicious behavior, and we need to verify who you are." David felt his eyebrows raise in confusion. "Suspicious behavior? I just got off a plane from my deployment. I'm heading home to see my family." He reached into his chest pocket and pulled out his military identification card, along with his driver's license. "Here's my ID and my military identification as well." Officer Carson took the cards but barely glanced at them before handing them to his partner. Mitchell examined them with an expression that suggested he was looking at something distasteful. The way he held the cards like they might be contaminated made David's jaw clench slightly. "These could be fake," Mitchell said after a long pause. "Anyone can get realistic-looking fake IDs these days. What we need to know is what you're really doing here and what's in those bags." David blinked slowly, trying to process what he was hearing. "Sir, that's my legitimate military identification. I'm Staff Sergeant David Thompson, returning from a deployment in Afghanistan. I can provide you with my orders, my flight information, anything you need to verify my identity." The growing crowd of passengers around the baggage carousel had started to notice the commotion. Some were pretending to mind their own business while clearly listening to every word. Others were more obvious about their interest, turning to watch the interaction unfold. David could see people reaching for their phones, probably wondering if they were about to witness something worth recording. "Look," Officer Carson said, stepping closer. "We don't know what kind of story you're trying to sell here, but we've got protocols to follow. You've been acting suspicious since you got off that plane, looking around nervously, checking over your shoulder. That's classic behavior for someone who's up to no good." David felt a surge of disbelief wash over him. "I was looking around because I haven't been home in over a year. I was taking in the sights of my own country after being deployed overseas. And I was checking over my shoulder because you two have been following me since I entered the terminal." "Don't get smart with us," Mitchell snapped. "We're just doing our jobs, keeping this airport safe from people who might want to cause trouble. Now, what's really in those bags?" "My personal belongings and military equipment," David answered, his voice remaining steady despite his growing frustration. "Nothing more, nothing less. Everything I own after 13 months overseas." A woman standing nearby, an elderly lady with silver hair and kind eyes, stepped forward slightly. "Officers, this young man is clearly a service member. Can't you see his uniform? Why are you harassing him like this?" Mitchell turned toward the woman with an irritated expression. "Ma'am, please step back and mind your own business. This is a security matter, and we know how to do our jobs." But the woman's intervention seemed to embolden other bystanders. A man in a business suit spoke up. "I was on the same flight as this soldier. He's been nothing but respectful and quiet the cool entire time. What exactly is he supposed to have done wrong?" David appreciated the support, but he could see that the officers were becoming more defensive and aggressive as the crowd grew larger and more vocal. This was exactly the kind of situation that could spiral out of control quickly. "Everyone needs to step back and let us handle this," Carson announced loudly. "This man is being detained for questioning, and anyone who interferes will be subject to arrest as well." David felt his heart rate increase. The word "detained" sent a chill down his spine. "Officers, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Here, I'm happy to cooperate with any reasonable security procedures, but I haven't done anything wrong. I'm a decorated soldier returning home from serving my country." "That's what they all say," Mitchell replied dismissively. "We've seen people try to use fake military credentials before. Just because you're wearing a uniform doesn't mean you're legitimate." The crowd was growing larger now, with people stopping their own travels to see what was happening. David could hear whispered conversations around him, with some people expressing outrage at how he was being treated, and others seeming to support the officer's actions. A young man with a veteran's cap approached the group. "I served 2 tours in Iraq," he said firmly. "I know a real soldier when I see one. This man's uniform, his bearing, his decorations. Everything about him screams legitimate military. What you're doing here is wrong. Sir, I'm going to ask you to step back one final time," Carson warned the veteran. "We have reasonable suspicion to detain this individual, and we're going to follow proper procedures." David looked around at the faces in the crowd. Some showed support and sympathy, others displayed curiosity or concern, and a few seemed to agree with the officer's suspicions. The whole situation felt surreal, like he was trapped in some kind of nightmare where being a decorated war veteran made him more suspicious rather than more trustworthy. "Officers," David said, his voice calm but firm. "I understand you have a job to do, but this is getting out of hand. I'm not resisting, I'm not being uncooperative, and I've provided you with legitimate identification. What exactly do you need? From me to resolve the situation?" Mitchell and Carson exchanged a look that David didn't like at all. It was the kind of look that suggested they had already made up their minds about how this encounter was going to end, regardless of what David said or did. "What we need," Mitchell said slowly, "is for you to come with us for further questioning, and we're going to need to search those bags thoroughly." The crowd around them had grown to at least 30 people now, and David could see multiple phones, pointed in their direction, recording everything. He knew that whatever happened next would likely be seen by thousands of people online within hours. David took a deep breath, drawing on the same inner strength that had gotten him through countless, dangerous situations overseas. He was about to need every bit of that strength to get through whatever was coming next. The moment David heard the metallic click of handcuffs, time seemed to slow down around him. He couldn't believe what was happening. 1 second he was a decorated soldier returning home to surprise his family, and the next he was being treated like a criminal in front of dozens of strangers. "Sir, you're under arrest for suspicious behavior and possible identity fraud," Officer Mitchell announced loudly, as if he wanted everyone in the terminal to hear. "You have the right to remain silent." David felt the cold metal tighten around his wrists behind his back. The handcuffs were snug, cutting slightly into his skin. He had been handcuffed during training exercises before, but this felt completely different. This felt humiliating and wrong in every possible way. "This is a mistake," David said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around him. "I'm a United States soldier. I've done nothing wrong." But his words fell on deaf ears. Officer Carson was already reaching for David's duffel bag, preparing to search through his personal belongings right there in the middle of the busy airport terminal. The crowd that had been watching the confrontation was now becoming more vocal and agitated. A woman with 2 small children pulled them closer to her, but she didn't walk away. Instead, she stood there with her phone raised, recording everything that was happening. "This is absolutely disgusting," she called out. "How can you treat a soldier like this?" An elderly man who had been quietly observing stepped forward. "I fought in Vietnam," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I've seen enough discrimination in my lifetime to recognize it when I see it. This young man deserves better than this." Officer Mitchell turned toward the growing crowd with an irritated expression. "Everyone needs to back up and give us space to do our job. This is a security matter, and we don't need an audience." But the crowd wasn't backing down. More people were stopping to see what was happening, and the general mood was becoming increasingly hostile toward the 2 officers. David could hear fragments of conversations around him. "That's a real soldier, you can tell by his uniform. Those officers are way out of line. Someone should call their supervisor. This is racial profiling, plain and simple." Officer Carson began pulling items out of David's duffel bag, scattering his personal belongings across the floor of the terminal. David watched in horror as his carefully packed clothes, toiletries, and personal items were dumped out for everyone to see. A framed photo of his wife Kelly and daughter Mia fell out of the bag and slid across the smooth floor. The glass cracked when it hit a support pillar, and David felt his heart break a little seeing his family's smiling faces behind the spider web of broken glass. "Please be careful with my things," David said, trying to keep his voice calm. "That photo is important to me." Carson barely glanced at the broken frame before continuing his search. He pulled out David's military dress uniform, the one he wore for formal ceremonies, and tossed it aside carelessly. The uniform crumpled on the floor, the brass buttons catching the overhead lights. Then Carson's hands found something that made him pause. It was a small wooden box, about the size of a jewelry case, with an official military seal on the top. Inside were David's military medals and commendations, each one representing months or years of dedicated service to his country. Carson opened the box and dumped the contents onto the floor as well. David's bronze star hit the ground with a small metallic sound that somehow seemed louder than all the noise around them. His Purple Heart, earned when he was injured by an improvised explosive device while saving 3 fellow soldiers, rolled a few feet away from the pile. "Those are my military decorations," David said, his voice beginning to show the strain of watching his most treasured possessions being treated like garbage. "Please don't do this." A man in the crowd who was wearing a military veteran's cap pushed his way forward. "Hey, do you have any idea what those medals represent? That bronze star means this man is a hero. He earned that Purple Heart bleeding for this country." Officer Mitchell turned around sharply. "Sir, I'm warning you for the last time. Step back or you'll be arrested too." But the veteran didn't step back. Instead, he got louder. "I spent 20 years in the Army, and I know what I'm looking at. This man has earned more respect in one deployment than you two will earn in your entire careers." Other voices in the crowd began joining in, creating a chorus of disapproval that echoed through the terminal. "This is wrong. Let him go. Call airport security. Where's your supervisor? David stood there in handcuffs, watching his life's most precious belongings scattered across the airport floor, while dozens of strangers defended him against the very people who were supposed to be protecting travelers like him. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had spent over a year protecting the freedom and safety of Americans, only to return home and be treated like a threat to that same freedom and safety. A young woman with a press badge hanging from her neck was now filming everything with a professional-looking camera. David realized this whole incident was probably going to end up on the news, which meant his wife Kelly might see it before he even got home. The thought of her watching her husband being humiliated on television made his stomach turn. Officer Carson continued his search, pulling out David's military orders and deployment paperwork. But instead of reading them carefully, he just glanced at them and tossed them aside with everything else. Official documents that had taken weeks to process and coordinate were now scattered on the dirty airport floor, being stepped on by curious onlookers. These could all be fake, Carson announced loud enough for the crowd to hear. We've seen sophisticated forgeries before. Anyone can make official-looking documents with a computer and printer these days. A businessman in an expensive suit who had been watching the entire scene unfold shook his head in disgust. I've traveled all over the world for my job, he said to the people around him. I've never seen anything like this in an American airport. This is embarrassing. David's military boots, the same boots that had walked through desert sands and Rocky Mountains in Afghanistan, were now planted firmly on American soil while he stood helpless to defend himself. The boots were scuffed and worn from months of hard use, and they told their own story of service and sacrifice. The crowd continued to grow, and David could see airport employees starting to take notice of the commotion. A janitor had stopped his work to watch what was happening. 2 flight attendants were whispering to each other and pointing in their direction. Even some of the TSA agents from the security checkpoint had come over to see what all the noise was about. Officer Mitchell was speaking into his radio, apparently calling for backup. David could hear fragments of his conversation. Need additional units, crowd getting hostile, suspect in custody. The word suspect hit David like a punch to the gut. After everything he had done for his country, after all the sacrifices he had made, he was now officially a suspect in the eyes of these officers. The man who had risked his life to protect American freedom was now being treated as a threat to American security. As more airport security personnel began arriving on the scene, David closed his eyes for a moment and tried to center himself. He thought about his training, about staying calm under pressure, about maintaining his dignity even in the worst circumstances. When he opened his eyes, he saw something that gave him a small glimmer of hope. Among the arriving security personnel was a woman in a supervisor's uniform, someone who looked like she might have the authority to put an end to this nightmare. She was walking quickly toward the scene, and the expression on her face suggested she was not happy about what she was seeing. Captain Elena Rodriguez had been working airport security for 12 years, and in all that time, she had never seen a crowd this angry or this vocal about a security incident. The noise from the baggage claim area could be heard halfway across the terminal, and multiple travelers were approaching her staff with complaints about what they were witnessing. As she hurried toward the commotion, Captain Rodriguez could see 2 of her officers standing over a black man in military uniform who was handcuffed with his belongings scattered all over the floor. The sight made her heart sink. She had specifically briefed her entire team that morning about treating all service members with extra respect and courtesy, especially those returning from deployment. "What in the world is going on here?" she demanded as she approached Officers Mitchell and Carson. The crowd parted slightly to let her through, but she could feel the hostile energy radiating from the dozens of people who had gathered to watch. "Captain, we've apprehended a suspect for suspicious behavior and possible identity fraud," Mitchell reported, trying to sound official and professional. He was acting nervous and carrying suspicious items. Captain Rodriguez looked down at the items scattered on the floor and felt her stomach drop. Among the clothes and personal belongings, she could clearly see military medals, official documents, and what appeared to be legitimate military identification cards. But what really caught her attention was a small leather folder that had fallen open near her feet. She bent down and picked up the folder, and her hands began to tremble as she read what was inside. It was a set of official orders from the Department of Defense, complete with military seals and signatures from high-ranking officers. The orders were for Staff Sergeant David Thompson, authorizing his return from Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. But that wasn't the most shocking part. As Captain Rodriguez continued reading, she realized these weren't ordinary deployment orders. They contained classification levels and code names that indicated David had been involved in special operations missions, the kind of missions that only the most elite and trusted soldiers were selected for. "Oh my God," she whispered, loud enough for people nearby to hear her. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Officer Carson looked confused. "Ma'am, we followed standard protocol for suspicious individuals." This man was acting nervous, and his identification could easily be forged. Captain Rodriguez looked up from the documents with a mixture of horror and disbelief on her face. "This man isn't suspicious, you idiots. He's a decorated war hero returning from a classified mission in Afghanistan. His name was on the VIP list I personally distributed to every security officer this morning." The words hit Mitchell and Carson like a physical blow. They both looked at each other with growing panic as the reality of their mistake began to sink in. Around them, the crowd was becoming even more agitated as they overheard pieces of the captain's revelation. "VIP list?" Mitchell stammered. "But we never received any." "I handed you the list personally at the morning briefing," Captain Rodriguez snapped. "Staff Sergeant David Thompson was supposed to receive special courtesy and assistance upon his arrival. Instead, you've arrested him and humiliated him in front of half the terminal." David, still standing in handcuffs, felt a mix of relief and vindication washing over him. Finally, someone in authority was seeing the truth of who he really was. But he also felt a deep sadness that it had taken this long and required this much drama for his identity to be recognized and respected. Captain Rodriguez quickly moved to David's side and began removing his handcuffs. "Sergeant Thompson, I cannot begin to express how sorry I am about this. This treatment is absolutely unacceptable, and it does not represent the values of this airport or our security team." As the handcuffs came off, David rubbed his wrists where the metal had left red marks on his skin. The crowd around them erupted, in a mixture of cheers and angry shouts directed at the two officers who had caused this entire situation. "I knew it," shouted the elderly Vietnam veteran. "I could tell from the moment I saw him that he was the real deal. Those officers should be ashamed of themselves." The woman with the press badge was recording everything, and David could see her speaking into a small microphone, probably providing live commentary for whatever news organization she worked for. He realized that this story was going to be much bigger than just a local incident. Captain Rodriguez bent down and began carefully collecting David's scattered belongings, handling each item with the respect it deserved. When she picked up his Bronze Star medal, she held it for a moment, examining the inscription that detailed the heroic actions that had earned him this honor. "Sergeant Thompson," she said, her voice filled with genuine emotion, "this medal represents extraordinary courage and dedication to your fellow soldiers and your country. The fact that my officers treated it like garbage is beyond unacceptable." David watched as she carefully placed each of his medals back in their proper case. His Purple Heart, earned when he was injured while evacuating wounded civilians from a bombed hospital, was gently cleaned off and returned to its place of honor. His Combat Infantry badge, representing his service in direct ground combat, was handled with the reverence it deserved. Officer Carson, who had been standing in stunned silence, finally found his voice. "Captain, we were just following our training. We thought we were keeping the airport safe." "Safe from what?" Captain Rodriguez turned on him with fury in her eyes. "Safe from one of our own heroes? Safe from a man who has spent the last 13 months risking his life to protect the very freedom that allows you to have this job?" The crowd was loving every moment of the officer's humiliation. People were applauding Captain Rodriguez's words and shouting their own opinions about the injustice they had witnessed. "Fire them both," someone yelled from the back of the crowd. "This is exactly why we need better training," another voice added. David's official deployment orders were carefully collected and reviewed by Captain Rodriguez, who shook her head as she read about the classified operations he had been involved in. She couldn't share the details with the crowd, But she could see that this man had been part of missions that had saved countless lives and advanced American interests in one of the most dangerous regions of the world. "Sergeant Thompson," she said, turning back to face him, "according to these orders, you've been involved in operations that I'm not even cleared to know about. The level of trust and responsibility that has been placed in you is extraordinary, and the way you've been treated today is a disgrace to everything you've sacrificed for." David nodded quietly, appreciating her words, but still feeling the sting of how he had been treated. "Thank you, Captain. I understand that mistakes happen, but this felt like something more than just a mistake." The honesty in his response hit everyone who heard it like a thunderbolt. He wasn't just talking about a procedural error or a case of mistaken identity. He was talking about the deeper issues of prejudice and assumption that had led to this entire incident. Captain Rodriguez understood exactly what he meant, and she knew that this incident was going to require much more than just an apology to make things right. The damage that had been done went far beyond scattered belongings and bruised wrists. It went to the heart of how America treats its own heroes when they don't look like what some people expect a hero to look like. "Officers Mitchell and Carson," she said, her voice carrying the weight of official authority, "you are both suspended, pending a full investigation into this incident. Report to my office immediately after we resolve this situation." The two officers stood there looking like they wished the ground would swallow them up. Their faces had gone pale as they realized their careers were probably over, and their actions had been witnessed and recorded by dozens of people who would never forget what they had seen. Within minutes of Captain Rodriguez removing David's handcuffs, the entire atmosphere in the airport terminal had changed. Word was spreading quickly through the crowds about what had really happened, and people who hadn't even witnessed the incident were now gathering to see the aftermath of what many were already calling a national disgrace. David stood quietly as Captain Rodriguez continued to personally collect and organize his belongings. She handled each item with careful respect, but he could see the anger and embarrassment in her eyes. This wasn't just about two officers making a mistake. This was about something much deeper and more troubling that reflected poorly on the entire airport security system. "Sergeant Thompson," Captain Rodriguez said as she carefully folded his military dress uniform, "I want you to know that what happened here today is not representative of how this airport or this country feels about our service members. You deserve so much better than this." David appreciated her words, but he could still feel the sting of humiliation from being handcuffed and searched like a criminal in front of dozens of strangers. "I understand, Captain. I know most people respect what we do overseas, but this kind of treatment makes you wonder sometimes." His quiet response hit everyone within earshot like a physical blow. Here was a man who had spent over a year fighting for his country, who had earned medals for extraordinary courage and sacrifice, and he was questioning whether his own country truly valued his service. The crowd around them fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. A woman near the front of the crowd, the same one who had been recording the incident with her phone, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "Sir, I want you to know that what I filmed today is going to be seen by millions of people, and every single one of them is going to be outraged by how you were treated. This is not okay, and people need to see that it's not okay." David nodded, gratefully. "Thank you, ma'am. I hope something good can come from all this." Captain Rodriguez's radio crackled to life, and David could hear urgent voices requesting updates on the situation. Airport management was clearly aware that something serious had happened, and they were scrambling to figure out how to handle what was quickly becoming a public relations nightmare. "Captain Rodriguez to control," she spoke into her radio. "I need the airport director down here immediately. We have a situation that requires his immediate attention." While they waited for senior management to arrive, David noticed that officers Mitchell and Carson were still standing nearby, looking like they wished they could disappear. Mitchell was staring at the floor, probably realizing that his career in airport security was over. Carson kept glancing nervously at the crowd, which was still growing larger and more vocal in their criticism. "I can't believe those two thought they could get away with this," said the elderly Vietnam veteran, who had become something of a spokesman for the angry crowd. "In my day, we knew how to respect our soldiers, regardless of what they looked like." A young woman with two small children spoke up. "This is exactly the kind of thing I worry about my kids seeing. How am I supposed to teach them to respect authority when authority acts like this?" David was touched by the support from strangers. But he was also aware that this incident was rapidly spiraling into something much bigger than anyone had expected. Multiple people were now filming with their phones, and he could see at least 3 different news crews arriving at the terminal entrance. Airport Director James Peterson arrived on the scene looking flustered and concerned. He was a well-dressed man in his 50s who clearly understood the gravity of what had happened. Captain Rodriguez quickly briefed him on the situation, and David watched his face grow more serious with each detail. "Sergeant Thompson," Director Peterson said, approaching David with his hand extended, "on behalf of Denver International Airport, I want to offer you my most sincere apologies. What happened here today is completely unacceptable and goes against everything we stand for as an institution." David shook his hand politely. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate that." "I want you to know that both officers involved in this incident have been immediately suspended pending a full investigation," Peterson continued. "We will also be reviewing our training procedures and implementing new policies to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again." The crowd around them murmured approval, but David could sense that many people felt like words and policy changes weren't enough to address what they had witnessed. Director Peterson gestured toward a uniformed airport employee who had been standing nearby. "I'd like to escort you to our VIP lounge where you can collect yourself in private and contact your family if you'd like. We'll also arrange for transportation home with our compliments." "That's very kind of you," David replied. "But honestly, all I want right now is to get home to my wife and daughter. They don't even know I'm back in the country yet. This was supposed to be a surprise." The mention of his family brought a new wave of emotion to the crowd. People realized that not only had David been mistreated, but his planned surprise reunion with his loved ones had been completely ruined by the actions of 2 prejudiced officers. "Sir," said the woman with the press badge, approaching David with her microphone, "would you be willing to make a brief statement about what happened here today? I think the American people need to hear from you directly." David considered the request for a moment. Part of him just wanted to disappear and try to salvage what was left of his homecoming. But another part of him knew that staying silent might allow this kind of treatment to happen to other service members in the future. "I'll make a brief statement," he said finally. The crowd gathered closer as David took a deep breath and looked directly into the camera. His military training had prepared him for many things, but he never expected to be giving an impromptu press conference in an airport terminal while still wearing his wrinkled combat uniform. "My name is Staff Sergeant David Thompson, and I just returned from a 13-month deployment in Afghanistan, where I served alongside some of the bravest men and women this country has ever produced. What happened here today was disappointing and hurtful, but it doesn't change my love for this country or my commitment to serving it." He paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I hope that people who see this story will understand that this isn't about me personally. This is about how we treat each other as Americans. Every person in uniform, regardless of their background or what they look like, deserves to be treated with basic respect and dignity. We all took the same oath, we all made the same sacrifices, and we all bled the same color when we got hurt protecting the freedoms that make this country great." The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, with many people wiping tears from their eyes. Even some of the airport employees who had gathered to watch were clapping and nodding in agreement. "I also want to thank all the people who stood up for me today," David continued. "Your support means more than you'll ever know. It reminds me why we do what we do overseas. We fight for people like you, people who believe in doing what's right, even when it's not easy." As David finished speaking, Director Peterson stepped forward again. "Sergeant Thompson, I want to personally ensure that your remaining travel home is as smooth as possible. We'll have a private car waiting to take you directly to your front door, and we'll make sure all your belongings are properly secured." David gathered his carefully repacked bags and began walking toward the airport exit, accompanied by Captain Rodriguez and Director Peterson. Behind him, the crowd gradually began to disperse, but many people were still talking excitedly about what they had witnessed. As they walked, David couldn't help but think about how different this day had turned out from what he had planned. Instead of quietly surprising his family, he was now part of a story that would probably be on the national news by evening. But maybe, he thought, something positive would come from all the negative attention. The automatic doors of the airport opened in front of him, and David stepped out into the cool Colorado evening air. After more than a year away, he was finally heading home to the people who mattered most to him. And despite everything that had happened, that was still the only thing that really mattered.